There is a clay tablet that does not list kings. It does not list temples, offerings, or the names of gods. It lists types, 8 of them, arranged in a column, marked with signs that share a root with the Sumerian word for sky law, the same word used for the decrees that govern the structure of all things. The scholars who translated the surrounding material called it administrative. They moved on, but the column remains. 8 categories of human being, each carrying something the text does not name as ancestry. It names it as code, and one of those categories carries a phrase still unresolved. Before we go further, if this is the kind of material you want more of, subscribe now and hit the bell. This channel goes where most history channels won't. New episodes drop regularly. Like this video if you think this deserves more attention than it gets. And drop a comment below. Which bloodline do you think you carry? I want to see your answers. Now, back to the tablets. Most people assume the Sumerians were record keepers of the obvious: grain tallies, land transfers, royal decrees. That is accurate, but it is not the complete picture. Because among the administrative tablets, among the inventory texts and temple accounts, there are documents that classify something else entirely. Not goods, not offerings, not the movements of armies or the marriages of kings. People. Not by name, not by city, not by tribe or bloodline in any genealogical sense, by function, by what they carry, by what they were described as being constitutionally equipped to do, or to hold, or to pass forward. There is a classification tradition in Sumerian textual material that most introductory accounts skip entirely. Not because it is obscure, it has been translated, it has been examined, but it sits at an uncomfortable angle to the standard narrative, which prefers to describe ancient Mesopotamian society in terms of priests and farmers and kings and scribes, social strata, clear hierarchies, roles that map neatly onto a world we can recognize. The 8-category system does not map neatly onto anything. The first thing to understand is what the Sumerians meant by the word that holds this system together. That word is me, pronounced roughly as may, and it is one of the most significant and least straightforwardly translatable concepts in all of Mesopotamian thought. The me are often described in English as divine decrees or divine laws, but that translation is already a simplification. The me are not commandments. They are not rules handed down from a moral authority. They are closer to structural ordinances, the operating principles that make each thing what it is. There is a me for kingship, a me for the scribal arts, a me for descent into the underworld, a me for music, a me for the preservation of truth, a me for the craft of the smith. The lists of me that survive in Sumerian hymnic and narrative literature run into the dozens, possibly into the hundreds. The disturbing thing about the me is not that they exist, it is that they are described as objects. They can be held, they can be given, they can be seized, stolen, lost, transported across water, recovered. In one of the most well-known Sumerian narratives, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu and receives the me from the god Enki, possibly while he is distracted, possibly as a genuine gift. The text is damaged in the critical section, and she carries them back to her city of Uruk. They are described almost like tablets themselves, physical things, containers of function. Now hold that in mind. The classification system under discussion uses the same root. The 8 categories of human being, described in the fragmentary administrative tradition, are marked with signs that point back to the me, not as metaphor, not as honorific, but as a structural descriptor. These people carry specific me, not as priests who channel divine power through ritual, as people in whose constitution certain me are encoded. That is a different claim. The scholarly reading of this material tends toward the social. The standard interpretation is that the Sumerians were describing professional or hereditary castes, families of scribes, families of priests, families of craftsmen, and that the religious language around those castes reflects the Sumerian worldview in which all human roles were divinely ordained. That reading is reasonable. It fits the evidence at a surface level. It produces a coherent picture of ancient Mesopotamian society. But the language does not quite cooperate. Because when you examine the descriptions attached to these 8 categories, what survives of them, in the fragmentary condition in which they survive, the words used are not the words Sumerians used for profession, caste, or hereditary role. The words are closer to constitution, to structure, to what a thing is made of at its deepest level, not what a person does, what a person is built to carry. And some of the functions described have no clear social role at all. One category is described in terms that translate roughly as awareness of passage, sensitivity to transitions, to thresholds, to the edges between states. There is no temple position for that. There is no craft guild. It describes something internal. Another category is described in terms that connect directly to celestial rhythm, not astronomical training, not observational skill, but a constitutional attunement to lunar cycles that is treated as a fixed characteristic, not an acquired one. A third category is described with language that appears in texts about the Abzu, the primordial deep water beneath the earth, in a way that suggests not geographical origin but structural affiliation, as if certain people carry something that belongs to the layer beneath the layer. These are not job descriptions, they are taxonomic entries. The difference matters. When a society describes a social role, it describes what a person does. When it describes a type, it describes what a person is. The Sumerians were careful with that distinction. Their scribal tradition was extraordinarily precise in vocabulary. They had different words for different kinds of knowing, different kinds of carrying, different kinds of belonging. The choice of words in these category descriptions is not casual, it is deliberate. And the deliberateness is exactly what makes the standard social interpretation feel slightly too comfortable. There is also the matter of where these categories appear. Not in myth cycles, not in hymns to gods, not in royal inscriptions celebrating divine favor. The tradition surfaces most clearly in administrative and temple archive contexts, the kinds of texts that deal with the management of real things in the real world. Grain, labor, land, personnel. That context matters enormously. When a category of human being appears in administrative material, it is because someone needed to track it. Someone needed to know who these people were and what they carried, and possibly where they were located. That is not the behavior of a civilization describing a metaphor. The list itself, 8 entries, arranged in a column, each marked with its own classification sign, survives in damaged form. Several entries are clear, several are partial. One, the last, is broken at exactly the point where the description should complete. Scholars have noted the damage. Some have noted the specific location of the damage, not the edge of the tablet, not a fire fracture, but the text itself, the middle of a sentence, a description that begins and does not end. What survives of the first entry carries the phrase that has proven most difficult to render in English. The literal signs suggest something like memory that precedes experience, or knowing before being told. Different translators have approached it differently. The most cautious rendering, the one that stays closest to the Sumerian without overreaching, is approximately this: those who carry the word before the word was given to them. That phrase does not describe a priestly lineage. It does not describe a hereditary craft. It describes a relationship to knowledge that exists outside the normal channels through which knowledge moves, through teaching, through initiation, through ritual transmission. The first category of people on this list is defined by the fact that they already know. Not know in the sense of being intelligent, not know in the sense of being educated, know in the sense of carrying content that arrived without being delivered. The normal explanation is that this is poetic language for intellectual inheritance. The scribal tradition was passed through families, and exceptionally gifted children of scribal families might seem to know what they hadn't been formally taught because the environment of their home had saturated them with it before formal instruction began. That explanation is sensible. It accounts for the phenomenon through ordinary means. But the wording describes arrival. It describes the knowledge as present before the context that would explain it, not absorbed, not inherited through proximity, carried in, already there. And the context in which this description appears is not a hymn to scribal excellence. It is an administrative categorization. It is a classification entry in a system designed to track and account for something. Somebody needed to know who these people were. Somebody was keeping the list. The list has 8 entries. The first is the one that carries knowledge before being given it. The second shares a root word with the first, but the function attached to it is not memory, it is not knowledge. It is something the Sumerians describe with a word that appears in their texts in only one other consistent context, the description of gates between worlds, the gates of the underworld, the thresholds that separate the living from the dead. The second bloodline does not remember before being told, it feels edges. And whoever compiled this list placed that function directly beside the first, as if the two were meant to be read together, as if one kind of carrying leads naturally into one kind of sensing, as if the code that some people carry requires others who know where its edges are. The Sumerians did not treat the underworld as a vague spiritual concept. It was a place with geography, with gates, 7 of them, stacked in sequence, each requiring the traveller to surrender something before passing. A crown, a garment, a name. The texts that describe the descent of Inanna into the underworld are among the most studied in Mesopotamian literature, and the detail with which the gates are rendered is striking. They are not symbolic barriers, they are procedural checkpoints. Each gate has a gatekeeper, each gatekeeper has a function. And in the fragmentary archive material that surrounds the 8-category list, one of the terms used for the second human type appears also in a damaged description of those gatekeepers, not as the gatekeeper itself, as the category of being that can correctly interact with the gate, as if certain gates require a certain kind of visitor, as if the threshold between worlds is not something any soul can navigate without the right constitutional equipment. The comfortable reading of Sumerian underworld material is that it is mythology, rich, elaborately imagined mythology, and that reading may be correct. But the uncomfortable detail is the same word, describing threshold sensitivity as an innate human trait, appearing in the list of human types and in the operational description of the underworld's architecture, not in a hymn about the glory of the gods, not in a royal inscription, in 2 separate administrative contexts, filed beside each other in the logic of a system someone was trying to maintain. That is the pattern this video is going to follow. Not one strange tablet, not one fragment that can be dismissed as poetic excess. A pattern, 8 entries, 8 functions, a system that appears in contexts where systems matter, where the people who wrote the texts were not composing literature, but keeping records. By the end, the 8 bloodlines will not look like separate curiosities, they will look like positions, slots in a structure. And the question the final chapter places on the table is one that the scribe who copied the list may also have been asking, because he wrote it into the clay, in the space where the 8th description should have concluded, as if he had reached the end of what he was permitted to know, and could only record that he did not know it. The scribal schools of ancient Sumer were called eduba, tablet houses. They were institutions of transmission. Children entered them young. They learned to press signs into wet clay, to read the inherited literature of the tradition, to copy and memorize and reproduce. The training was rigorous. It was also, in a fundamental sense, about receiving knowledge that already existed. The student came empty. The tradition filled him. That is how the eduba was supposed to work. But embedded in the material associated with scribal culture, in references to specific individuals who moved through the tablet houses in a way that did not follow the expected pattern, there is a set of descriptions that trouble the clean model of transmission. Descriptions of individuals who arrived at the scribal school already oriented, who copied signs they had not been shown, who demonstrated understanding of structural relationships in the texts before the teachers had introduced those structures. The standard explanation is prodigy, exceptional memory, cultural osmosis, children of scribal families, absorbing the tradition through proximity before formal instruction. These explanations are available, and they are not wrong as far as they go. But the Sumerian texts do not use the words for prodigy or giftedness. The words they use are different. Closer to preloaded, closer to already filled. The distinction in the original language is between someone who learned quickly and someone who arrived with the content already in place. Sumerian vocabulary was precise enough to make that distinction. The scribes who wrote these descriptions were making it deliberately. There is a surviving line, fragmentary, preserved in a later copy of what appears to have been a temple administrative record, that describes a category of individual within the scribal community, using language that does not fit the educational framework at all. The line is roughly rendered as, "They carry the word before the word was given to them." The word in question here, the word for word, is not simply the Sumerian term for a spoken message. It carries connotations of decree, of structural designation, of the kind of meaning that is not composed but assigned. It is the word used in me contexts, in contexts where the fundamental organizing principles of existence are being described. So the line is not saying these people are gifted students who learn fast. It is saying they carry assigned structural content that predates the moment of their learning. That is a different claim. It is a claim about the origin of what they know, not their capacity to acquire knowledge, but the pre-existence of knowledge inside them before acquisition occurs. Now, the normal reading of this is metaphorical. The scribal tradition was hereditary. Knowledge passed through families. A child born into a long line of temple scribes inherits not just instruction, but a shaped environment, a household saturated in the language, logic, and symbolism of the tradition. By the time formal education begins, the child has absorbed years of context. What looks like pre-existing knowledge is simply early and thorough immersion. That explanation is plausible. It accounts for the observation through ordinary means. The problem is the administrative context. This description does not appear in a hymn to scribal excellence or a literary celebration of the tradition. It appears in what looks like a categorization document, a text designed not to praise a quality, but to identify and record a type. Administrative texts categorize in order to track. They track in order to manage. You do not track something that is simply a metaphor for cultural inheritance. You track something that has operational significance, something you need to know the location and status of. Why would you need to track people who carry the word before the word is given to them? That question does not have a comfortable answer inside the standard framework. If this is simply poetic language for hereditary intellectual ability, there is no administrative reason to maintain a separate category for it. You would just call them scribes. You would note their family line. You would record their training. You would not create a distinct classification with its own marker sign that connects it to the me. Unless what you are tracking is not their profession. Unless what you are tracking is what they carry. Specifically, what category of me is encoded in their constitution. Unless the classification system is not a record of who does what, but a record of who holds what, and the first bloodline holds a particular portion of the structural code of the world in a form that does not require delivery. It arrived with them. The emotionally unsettling version of this is not hard to construct, but the evidence does not require you to go there. The evidence only requires you to sit with what the text actually describes, a category of human being, marked with a specific administrative sign, characterized by carrying structured knowledge that precedes its own transmission, recorded not in mythology, not in religious praise poetry, in what looks like a personnel system. And the people reading this right now who have felt, at various points in their lives, that they understood something before they were taught it, not in the vague sense of intuition, but in the specific sense of encountering a system or a structure and recognizing it, as if from somewhere behind memory. Those people are not the subject of this video. This video is not making a claim about them. It is only noting that the Sumerians appear to have identified a category, given it a name, and filed it in their administrative record alongside grain tallies and temple accounts. They thought it was real enough to track. The second bloodline shares a root morpheme with the first. The two categories are related in the Sumerian classification, not identical but connected. Where the first carries knowledge, the second carries something different. The first bloodline knows, the second feels where things end. And the word used to describe that sensitivity, that constitutional awareness of edges and thresholds, does not appear in the literature about human types with any frequency. It appears in one other consistent context in the Sumerian textual record, the operational descriptions of the gates of the underworld. Not what the gates are, What kind of being is required to correctly open them? The Sumerian underworld, the land the texts call Kur, or the Great Below, is one of the most elaborately described afterlife environments in ancient literature. It is not a place of flames, it is not a place of torment, in the sense that later traditions would develop. It is a place of administration, of procedure, of careful, methodical process. The dead enter through gates. They pass gatekeepers. They are named, registered, assigned. They consume dust. They wear feathers as clothing. They exist in a dim, bureaucratic half-life that the Sumerians described with the same precision they brought to their grain accounting. The 7 gates are the entry architecture. Each one is a threshold between states, between alive and less alive, between this world and that one, and the texts that describe the operation of those gates are careful to distinguish between different types of interaction with them. Most souls pass through because they must. Some interact with the gate in a different way, as if the gate recognizes something in them, as if there is a category of encounter with a threshold that requires a different constitutional equipment than simply dying and being processed. The second Bloodlines classification term appears in proximity to this category of gate interaction, in a damaged fragment that has not received extensive commentary. The association is not explicit, the tablet is too broken to permit certainty, but the proximity of the terms is legible, and it suggests that the second human type, the one characterized by threshold sensitivity, by awareness of edges between states, was considered by the Sumerians to have a specific operational relationship to the architecture of passage between worlds, not as priests administering the rites of the dead, not as religious specialists performing funerary ritual, as people whose constitution is calibrated to the frequency of thresholds, as if they feel the difference between states in a way others do not. And that feeling is not metaphorical, not spiritual in the later sense. It is structural. It is what they are made of. There is a question worth sitting with. If you are the kind of person who notices transitions, who feels the moment a room changes before anything visible has shifted, who is aware of the precise boundary between sleeping and waking in a way most people are not, who experiences threshold states as texturally distinct rather than simply as fuzzy edges, the Sumerians would have had a category marker for you. They would have placed you in a column beside the person who already knows what they were never taught. And then they would have noted what the third category carries, because the third entry on the list uses a word that does not appear in any temple archive, any underworld text, any description of scribal practice or social function. It appears in the astronomical tablets, beside descriptions of the moon, and the specific term used for the moon in that context is not the ordinary Sumerian word for the lunar body. It is a phrase that has been cautiously translated as the place where the moon was set. There is a word in Sumerian that is usually translated as gatekeeper. It describes the functionary stationed at a threshold, the being whose role is to manage passage from one state to another. In the underworld texts, the gatekeepers are divine beings. They are not human. They execute their function with the mechanical consistency of the administrative system they serve. They do not welcome, they do not comfort, they assess, permit, or deny. But there is a separate category in the Sumerian record, not the gatekeepers themselves, but a class of human being whose constitutional makeup seems designed to interact with thresholds in a way that differs from ordinary passage. And the description of this class does not use spiritual language, it uses physical language. It describes the body, the skin, the breath, the specific quality of stillness that a person of this type exhibits when they are standing at an edge. This is the second bloodline, not priests, not shamans in the later anthropological sense, not spiritual intermediaries who perform a ritual role, something more fundamental. The Sumerian description treats this type's threshold sensitivity the way it treats other constitutional facts, the way it treats the color of clay, the weight of grain, the carrying capacity of a canal, as a property, as a measurable, trackable characteristic of a specific kind of thing. The normal reading of liminal sensitivity in ancient religious contexts is archetypal. The mediator between worlds is a universal figure. Every tradition has one: the shaman, the priest, the psychopomp, the death walker. And scholars who encounter this category in Sumerian material tend to read it through that lens. Another version of the universal threshold archetype, dressed in Mesopotamian clothing. That reading is not wrong, but it obscures a distinction the Sumerian texts are actually making. The universal threshold archetype is a role. It is something a person is assigned, trained into, initiated toward. The shaman becomes a shaman through a process. The priest is ordained. The death walker is called and responds and is changed by the calling. The role exists outside the person, and the person enters it. What the Sumerian second bloodline description captures is not a role. It is a constitutional fact. It is described as something the person has before they are assigned any function, before they undergo any training, before they are recognized by any institution. The sensitivity to thresholds is described as innate, present in the structure of the person the way the me is present in the things that carry it. Not conferred, not acquired, already there. That is a different claim than the archetype, and the physical vocabulary supports it. The words used describe observable phenomena, the stillness of the body at a threshold, the change in the quality of breath when this type of person stands at an edge between states. These are not metaphors for spiritual readiness. They are phenomenological descriptions. The scribe is describing something that could in principle be observed, something someone watched and wrote down. Why would you watch that? Why would you document the specific physical behavior of a person standing at a threshold if the phenomenon were simply a metaphor for priestly calling? You would document it because you needed to identify these people, because they had a function in a system, and the system required that the right people be placed at the right positions. And the right people for certain positions were not the ones with the most spiritual training or the most social authority. They were the ones whose bodies registered edges in a specific way. The damaged fragment that places the second bloodline's classification term in proximity to the underworld gate descriptions is not, by itself, proof of anything. The tablet is too broken. The association could be coincidental. But the logic of the classification system supports a non-coincidental reading. If you are categorizing human types by what they are constitutionally equipped to do, and if one category is constitutionally equipped to correctly interact with thresholds between states, then the operational locations where that type would be most useful are exactly the threshold locations the Sumerians had most elaborately mapped. The 7 gates, the edges of the worlds, placed there not because they volunteered, not because they were chosen by divine favor, but because they were that type, and that type fits that position, and someone was keeping the list of who was that type and where they were. The feeling of this, if you allow yourself to sit with it, is less religious than it is logistical. It feels like staffing, like a very ancient, very serious organization assigning personnel to positions based on constitutional profiles. And the organization understood that certain positions could not be filled by just anyone. They required a specific kind of person, the kind whose skin knows the difference between here and not here before their mind can name it. The third entry on the list moves into different territory. It does not describe a sensitivity to thresholds in space, the edges between realms, the gates of the underworld. It describes a sensitivity to thresholds in time, specifically to the rhythmic thresholds of the sky, the points in the lunar cycle where one phase becomes another, the moments of celestial transition that the Sumerians tracked with extraordinary precision in their astronomical archives. The classification word for the third bloodline appears in the text of a lunar omen series, a damaged tablet fragment embedded in a tradition that spans centuries of Mesopotamian astronomical record-keeping. And the context of its appearance is not a description of an astronomer. It is not a description of a priest performing lunar divination. The context is a description of accuracy, of a category of person whose constitutional relationship to the lunar cycle produces correct readings without the inferential steps that formal training requires. Not because they studied, because the moon already meant something to their body, and the specific term used for the moon in this fragment is not the standard Sumerian word for the lunar body. It is a phrase that translates cautiously as the place where the moon was set, not where it rises, not what it is called, where it was placed. That phrasing matters. Set implies placement, Placement implies an agent. Placement implies that the moon's position in the sky was not simply the natural consequence of cosmological physics, or at least that the Sumerians, in this fragment, were not describing it as if it were. They were describing it as if the moon occupied a position it had been put in. The Sumerians were sophisticated sky watchers. This is not a controversial claim. The astronomical tradition of ancient Mesopotamia produced records of celestial phenomena that modern researchers still consult for historical baseline data. Observations of planetary cycles, of eclipses, of the behavior of Venus across its phases. These were tracked and recorded with a rigor that reflects centuries of patient, systematic observation. The Sumerians knew the sky. They respected it as a domain of ordered, predictable, measurable reality, which makes the language of the lunar omen fragment more striking, not less. These were not people who casually threw mystical language at celestial bodies because they didn't understand them. They understood the moon in operational detail. They tracked its behavior across long cycles. They used its position to calculate agricultural seasons, to regulate civic calendars, to read omens that were treated with the seriousness of intelligence reports. Against that background of precision, a phrase that describes the moon as set, placed, is not the product of vague mythological imagination. It is a deliberate choice by people who had other, more neutral words available and chose not to use them. And the third bloodline's classification marker appears beside this phrase, a human type described as constitutionally calibrated to this placed moon, not calibrated in the sense of performing lunar ritual correctly, calibrated in the sense of accuracy, producing correct assessments of lunar significance without the inferential chain that trained astronomical priests required. The mainstream reading of lunar sensitivity in ancient cultures is, again, straightforwardly religious. The moon was a god. In Sumerian theology, the moon god Nana, later Suen, later still Sin in Akkadian tradition. And sensitivity to the moon is sensitivity to divine presence, divine will, divine communication. The person who reads the moon correctly is the person the god speaks through. Religious metaphor, standard ancient framework. But the third bloodline description does not use divine communication language. It does not describe a person receiving messages from a lunar deity. It describes a person whose readings are accurate because of something in their constitution. The accuracy is described as a property, not a gift, a characteristic, not a calling. The further implication, and this is where careful framing becomes essential, is that the moon being described as set, as placed, may be connected to why certain human constitutions resonate with it. If the moon is a natural body with no particular relationship to human biology, then constitutional calibration to its cycles is poetic language for sensitivity to light levels, tidal forces, circadian rhythms, all of which are real phenomena, documentable, non-mysterious. But if the Sumerians were describing the moon as placed, as a positioned object in a system, rather than simply a natural celestial body, then the category of human beings whose constitution mirrors that object takes on a different character. They are not just attuned to a natural cycle. They are calibrated to a positioned element of a structure, and the structure was designed by something. That reading may go too far. The fragment is damaged. The surrounding context is partial. The translation tradition for the specific phrase is not unanimous, but the phrase survives. The classification marker survives. The association between the third bloodline and the placed moon survives. And that association does not appear in any other human typology in the ancient Mesopotamian record, which means the Sumerians had a category for this. One slot on the 8-entry list, assigned to people whose bodies map to a celestial body, described as positioned rather than simply present. The 4th entry does not appear in astronomical records. It does not appear in underworld gate texts. It appears in no temple archive that deals with the human world as it is normally understood. The 4th bloodline's classification marker shows up only in a specific cluster of texts associated with one location and one domain of Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu, the deep water beneath everything, Enki's domain, the place that existed before the gods organized the sky above. The Abzu is one of the stranger concepts in Sumerian cosmology, and it is strange in a specific way. It is not strange because it is vague. It is strange because it is both utterly concrete and radically prior to everything else the Sumerians described. In the cosmological framework of ancient Mesopotamia, the Abzu is the body of fresh water that exists beneath the earth. It is the source of springs. It is the underground reservoir that wells tap. It is a physical, geological reality that the Sumerians mapped and used and built temples over. The temple complex at Eridu, one of the oldest cities in the ancient world, associated with the god Enki, included a ritual pit or basin called the Abzu, representing or connecting to the cosmic deep. The Abzu was real in that sense. You could build something over it. But the Abzu was also something else. In the cosmological accounts, it existed before the current divine order was established, before Enlil divided sky from earth, before the great gods organized the functional domains of existence. The Abzu was already there, and whatever was in it, whatever knowledge, whatever structural principle, whatever original architecture of things, was older than the organization that came after. Enki, the god most associated with the Abzu, is the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft, of magic, of creation. He is the one the other gods consult when a problem is too hard to solve by force or authority. He knows things the sky gods do not know because he has access to the layer beneath. He can reach into the Abzu and draw out solutions that come from before the current arrangement. The fourth bloodline is described with language that places it in structural affiliation with this domain, not with Enki as a deity, not as worshippers of Enki, not as priests of the Eridu temple. The affiliation is described at the level of origin, as if the fourth category of human being carries something that comes from the layer beneath the current layer, from the deep that existed before the naming. The mainstream reading is straightforward mythology. The Abzu as origin domain is a creation motif. Primordial water as the source of all things appears in multiple ancient traditions, in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, in Genesis, in Egyptian cosmology. It is a near-universal symbolic structure representing undifferentiated potential prior to the act of creation and ordering. The fourth bloodline's association with the Abzu is, in this reading, a way of describing a type of person with a connection to primal or undifferentiated wisdom, creative in the fundamental sense, close to origin. That reading is available. It is tidy. It fits the comparative religious framework. What it does not account for is the language of containment. The Abzu in the fourth bloodline description is not described as formless. It is not described as chaotic or undifferentiated. The texts associated with this category use language that suggests the Abzu is sealed, contained, that what is in it is not dissolved into formlessness, but preserved in a specific, bounded condition. And the fourth bloodline is described not as originating from this depth in a mythological sense, but as carrying a specific key to it. Not a metaphorical key, a functional one. There is a surviving line, partially damaged, preserved in what appears to be a registration text rather than a hymn, that describes this bloodline type using language roughly rendered as, from before the naming, one line was not named, it was kept. The phrase has multiple possible readings. Most translators approach it as a reference to the antediluvian period, the time before the flood, before the great reset that the Sumerians described in their own flood narratives. But the word kept is the problem, because kept is not the word you use for something passively surviving. Kept is the word you use for something deliberately maintained, stored, protected, watched over. One line was not named, it was kept. The naming of things, in Sumerian cosmological thought, is an act of ordering. When Enlil separates sky from earth, when the gods assign functions and domains through the me, they are naming things into their roles. The named thing takes its place in the structure. It is located, it is managed, it participates in the current arrangement. The fourth bloodline was not named. It was kept, it was maintained outside the act of naming, outside the process by which the current world was organized, which means it carries something that does not belong to the current order, something from beneath the naming, something from the Abzu depth that existed before the gods organized the sky. That is an unsettling description of a category of human being, not because it is supernatural, because it is administrative, because somebody recorded it in what looks like a registration context. Somebody needed to know that this type existed. Somebody was tracking which people carried the unnamed thing. And the word kept implies an agent, implies intentionality. Something or someone maintained this line through the naming, through the organization of the current world, through whatever reset or restructuring the flood narratives encode. Something ensured that the fourth bloodline continued to exist in a world that was being remade around it. The people reading this who have felt, in moments of unusual clarity, that they are in contact with something that does not belong to the visible order of things, something older, quieter, more structural than the surface of the world permits. The Sumerians appear to have had a registration category for that feeling, not a spiritual category, a logistical one. But the fifth bloodline is where the list begins to generate its own warning, because the fifth entry is the first one accompanied by a caution, not a curse, not a divine prohibition, a practical warning, and the specific caution attached to it, in the fragmentary form in which it survives, suggests that the fifth bloodline is the most operationally volatile of the first five, not because it is the most powerful, because it does not hold what passes through it. It transmits. And a transmission system that does not know it is a transmission system is, in the language of the text, the kind of thing that can damage both what it receives and what it passes on. To understand why that caution matters, it helps to sit with what the Sumerians meant by knowledge traveling between beings. In their cosmological system, the me, the divine ordinances, the structural codes of all things, could be transmitted. Inanna receiving the me from Enki is the most famous instance, but the principle is broader. The me were not static possessions. They moved. They could be carried across water, through gates, from city to city, from god to human and back. They were dynamic. They participated in the world not as fixed properties, but as transferable contents. The question the fifth bloodline raises is, what happens when a human being is constitutionally configured as a channel for that kind of transfer? Not a container, not a holder, a channel. Something the content moves through rather than something that holds it. The Sumerian tradition has a word for beings that function as conduits for divine decree, beings through whom the word of the gods passes into the world. But those beings are described as knowing their function, as being oriented toward it, trained for it, prepared for it through ritual, through study, through the specific practices the temple system maintained, precisely to manage the volatility of direct contact with divine transmission. The fifth bloodline description suggests a different situation, people who function as conduits without the preparation, without the training, without the ritual orientation that would make the transmission manageable. They carry the old code through them. It moves through them into the world, and they may not know it is happening. That is the caution. Not a curse, not a divine punishment. A practical concern about operational risk. The same concern you would have about any system in which a conduit does not know it is a conduit. A sealed container is stable. A channel without awareness of its own channeling function is not. The Sumerian concept of divine speech is not what later traditions made of prophecy. It is not the god whispering to the chosen human, who then translates the message into human language and delivers it to the people. That model, the prophet as interpreter, the divine voice filtered through human understanding, is a later refinement. It is a model built around mediation, around the human as a conscious, active participant in the transmission. The older description, the one that surfaces in texts associated with Enki and with the operations of divine decree, is less comfortable. It describes certain transmissions not as messages received and interpreted, but as content that moves through a being without requiring the being's understanding. The me, when transmitted, does not need the carrier to comprehend it. It only needs a channel with the right constitutional properties. The channel is not interpreting. The channel is conducting. The fifth bloodline is described this way, not as people who receive divine messages, as people through whom the old code, the me, the structural decrees of the organized world, moves into the material layer without filtering, without interpretation, without the person's conscious participation. The normal reading of this kind of description is the prophetic archetype. Every ancient tradition has the vessel, the person through whom the divine speaks, who may not fully understand what is moving through them. The Delphic oracle, the spirit-possessed shaman, the ecstatic priest. These are all versions of the same role, and scholars reading the fifth bloodline category tend to fit it into this archetype, another version of the divinely inspired human conduit. But the word used is not the word for prophetic inspiration. It is not the word for divine possession in the ritual sense. The Sumerian scribal tradition was exquisitely precise about the vocabulary of altered states and divine contact. They had different words for different kinds of divine presence in a human being. What they used for the fifth bloodline category is closer to the word for a material channel, a functional structure through which a substance moves. The same word appears in texts about irrigation systems, about canals, about the directed movement of water through constructed passages. That is not poetic language for prophecy. That is structural language for a category of thing that conducts content without transformation, which is why the caution attached to this bloodline is not moral. It does not say, "Be careful because this power can be misused." It says, in the fragmentary form in which it survives, something roughly rendered as, "What passes through them is not theirs to keep," and without knowing what they carry, they may not know when they have emptied themselves. That is a warning about depletion, about a conduit that runs without knowing it is running, about a channel that transmits without receiving the restorative orientation that the trained priests received through their ritual practice. The fifth bloodline carries something real. The me passes through them. But without the knowledge that this is happening, they cannot manage it. They transmit and they exhaust. They conduct and they do not know what has moved through them. The administrative context in which this appears lists the fifth bloodline among what the text calls restricted categories. Not forbidden, not dangerous in the way that something prohibited is dangerous. Restricted in the way that something requiring careful management is restricted. The kind of category you maintain under controlled conditions because the consequences of losing track of it are significant. Restricted, the same word used for grain stores that require special accounting, for temple objects that cannot be handled by unauthorized personnel, for passages in certain buildings that only specific functionaries may use. The fifth bloodline was classified as restricted. That detail has not generated extensive scholarly commentary. The tablet section it appears in is usually read as a list of categories requiring special administrative attention. Scholars note it, move on. It does not fit neatly into the framework of Sumerian religious hierarchy as usually described. But if you take the classification system at face value, as a real administrative record of human constitutional types and their operational properties, then restricted takes on a different weight. You restrict something when you need to control where it goes and what it contacts. You restrict a conduit when you need to manage what it transmits. The sixth bloodline does not appear in the restricted list. It does not appear in any clean administrative context at all. Its classification marker shows up in a damaged section of a tablet that has been partially reconstructed from multiple fragments. Fragments found in different locations, suggesting the original tablet was broken and dispersed before the modern excavation that recovered what remains of it. The sixth bloodline's entry is partially readable, enough to confirm it is a distinct category, not enough to confirm its full description. What survives of the sixth entry is a single descriptive term that does not appear anywhere else in the Sumerian administrative record, a unique sign combination. Scholars who have examined it note its uniqueness and, finding no parallel in other texts, offer only cautious and provisional readings. The most conservative translation is roughly, "Those who were marked in the space between arrangements, between organized states of the world. Not before this world, not after it, in the space between one arrangement and the next, in the transition itself, in the moment of reset." And that term, that unique, unparalleled sign combination, appears one other time in the entire surviving Sumerian textual record. At the edge of a broken tablet in a destroyed archive category, a category of text that was apparently destroyed, deliberately or accidentally, before the modern scholarly record was able to reconstruct it fully. The fragment survives. The broader archive does not. The sixth Bloodlines marker appears on a fragment from a destroyed archive. What the archive contained, what the broader context of that fragment was, what the sixth Bloodlines full description said, all of it is gone. What remains is the fragment, the marker, the sign that appears in one other place in all of Sumerian textual history, which is the broken administrative entry for a human type described as marked in the space between arrangements. Those of the sixth bloodline, whatever they fully were, existed most specifically in transitions, in the space the system passed through when one world arrangement ended and another began. The Sumerians had a framework for world transitions. It was not an abstract philosophical concept. It was embedded in their flood narratives, in their king lists, in the structure of their historical consciousness. The world had been reset before. A great flood had ended one arrangement of things, and a new arrangement had begun. The pre-flood world had its own kings, rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods, suggesting that the pre-flood world operated under different structural conditions. The post-flood world had shorter reigns, closer to human scale. The reset had changed something fundamental about how the world was organized. And in the antediluvian tradition, the tradition about the world before the flood, there were beings called the Abkalu, often translated as sages, 7 of them, described as existing before the flood, carrying knowledge from the deep, from the Abzu, Enki's domain, into the human world. They taught civilization. They transmitted the arts, the crafts, the skills that constituted ordered human life. And when the flood came, that knowledge had to survive somehow. The tradition suggests it did, that certain people carried it through, that the transition from the old world to the new world was not a complete erasure because certain carriers survived and brought the old code with them. The 6th, 7th, and 8th bloodlines on the list appear to describe those carriers, the people who exist in the space between arrangements, the people who were present at the transition and came through it with something from the other side. That context is what makes the destroyed archive so significant. If the 6th bloodline's full description existed in a category of text that was destroyed, deliberately or accidentally, then what was lost is precisely the most detailed account of what a person looks like who exists most naturally in transitions between world arrangements. The marker survives, the description does not. And the 7th and 8th bloodlines, which follow the 6th on the list, are the most disturbing entries of all. The 7th survives intact enough to read. The 8th does not survive intact at all. What remains of the 8th entry is not a description, it is a question, written by the scribe who was copying the list. As if the scribe reached the end of what the record permitted and found himself looking at something the record could not answer. The 7th and 8th bloodlines are where the list stops being a taxonomy of function and becomes something stranger. They are not assigned roles in the current world. They are not described as carrying skills or sensitivities or calibrations useful in the present arrangement. They are described as belonging to the previous one, as survivors not in the biographical sense, not as people who lived through the flood and emerged on the other side, but in the structural sense, as people in whom something from the previous arrangement of the world is still active, still running, still organized according to rules the current world replaced. The Sumerian king list is one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient history. It survives in multiple copies, scattered across museums and institutions, assembled from fragments found at different excavation sites across Mesopotamia. What it contains is a sequential record of kingship, the succession of rulers in the cities of Sumer, stretching back before the flood. The pre-flood section is the famous one, the one that produces the raised eyebrows. The kings listed before the flood are assigned reigns of extraordinary length, not decades, thousands of years. The first king on the list is said to have reigned for 28,800 years, his successor for 36,000. The lengths diminish as the list progresses through the pre-flood period, but they remain, by any normal historical standard, impossible. Scholars explain this as mythological inflation, as the kind of exaggeration ancient traditions apply to legendary ancestors to signal their primordial importance. The numbers are not meant to be taken literally. They represent a different order of existence, a different relationship to time, a world where the ordinary constraints of human life did not apply because the world was differently arranged. That explanation is reasonable. It fits the comparative framework. Many ancient traditions assign impossibly long lives to primordial ancestors, the biblical patriarchs, for instance, with their centuries of lifespan gradually diminishing toward the familiar as the generations approach the historical period. But the Sumerian king list does not read like mythology. It reads like a record. The formatting is administrative, the same dry, sequential, columnar style used for grain inventories and personnel records. The list does not celebrate the pre-flood kings. It does not hymn them. It does not describe their deeds or their greatness. It simply records the length of their reigns with the same flat, bureaucratic precision used for everything else in the Sumerian archival tradition. A record of something the record keepers could not explain, presented in the format they used for things they could. And the Apkallu, the 7 sages associated with the pre-flood world, are described in a related tradition as the transmitters of civilization, the 7 beings who carried knowledge from the Abzu, from the deep, into the human world during the period of the long rains. After the flood, the tradition continues with post-diluvian Apkallu, later sages, diminished versions, who attempted to maintain the transmission into the new arrangement. But something had been lost in the transition. The knowledge that came through was incomplete. The post-flood world received a partial copy of what the pre-flood world had held. This is the context in which the 7th and 8th bloodlines on the list must be understood. The 7th entry, the one that survives intact enough to read, describes a bloodline with no assigned function in the current world, no temple role, no astronomical function, no social position, no description of what these people do or carry in terms useful to the present arrangement. What the 7th entry says, in the most careful translation available from the surviving text, is approximately those who were present before the counting began. Before the counting began. The counting here refers to the post-flood king list, the era of accountable, human-scale reigns. The period that began when the flood ended and the new arrangement of the world started its own record. Before that, the 7th bloodline was present before the counting began. That is not an ancestry claim in any normal sense. It does not say these people are descended from someone who lived in the pre-flood world. It says they were present, as a type, as a category, as a constitutionally distinct variety of human being who existed before the current era of human history began its accounting. What does it mean for a bloodline to have been present before the counting began? The mythological reading is that this is a reference to divine or semi-divine ancestry, the tradition of gods or divine beings interbreeding with human lines, producing exceptional descendants who carry something of the divine in their constitution. That reading is available. It is consistent with the broader Mesopotamian tradition of heroes and kings claiming divine parentage. But the administrative framing resists it. The category is not described as divinely descended. It is described with the same flat, positional language used for the other 7 categories. Present before the counting began, recorded, tracked, maintained in the list. The same list that records threshold walkers and lunar-calibrated individuals and Abzu keepers. The same administrative logic, not a myth, a catalogue entry. The 7th bloodline is a slot in a system, and the slot predates the current system's records. The emotional texture of this, if you let yourself feel it, is disorienting. Not because it is supernatural, because it is bureaucratic. Because the most disturbing implication of the 7th bloodline's entry is not that these people have divine power or ancient wisdom or spiritual gifts. The disturbing implication is that someone was tracking them. Someone had a list. Someone maintained a record of a category of human being that predated the current world's accounting system, and they kept that record in the same document as grain tallies and temple personnel. They thought it was a practical matter. They thought knowing who these people were and where they were was operationally important. And they filed the 7th bloodline's entry in the column with the others and moved on to the 8th. And then the 8th entry begins and does not finish. What survives of the 8th entry is a partial classification mark, damaged, partially readable, and then a sequence of signs that have been examined carefully by those who have worked with the tablet. Those signs are not a description, they are a question. The scribal hand changes slightly, the pressure on the clay, the angle of the stylus, a detail only apparent in high-resolution imaging of the tablet surface. The scribe who was copying this list reached the 8th entry and wrote something that was not copied from a source, something the scribe added, something the scribe was asking. The sign sequence does not translate cleanly. The most conservative rendering is roughly, what is still waiting to be placed? Not what is the 8th bloodline. Not a description of a type or a function or a constitutional characteristic. A question about something that has not yet been assigned its position, something that exists but has not yet been placed in the structure that the other 7 entries fill. The 8th slot on the list is not a description, it is a vacancy. A vacancy in an administrative system is not an empty cell in a spreadsheet. A vacancy is a slot being held for something that has not yet arrived, or has not yet been recognized, or has not yet been placed in its correct position within the structure. The 8th bloodline's entry is a slot held open, marked, identified as existing, but without a description, without a function, without a constitutional characteristic assigned to it. The scribe who copied the list reached this entry and found, what? A source document that was already damaged at this point, a category that the tradition knew existed but had never been able to fully describe, an entry that had been deliberately left incomplete because the people who maintained the list did not yet know enough about the 8th type to fill in its description. Or did the scribe reach the end of the list and realize that the 8th entry was not something that had been lost from the record, it was something that had never been recorded, because the 8th bloodline had not yet done whatever it was that would make its function legible to the system. These are all possible readings. The tablet does not settle the question. The tablet asks it, and the question it asks, what is still waiting to be placed, is one of those questions that has a way of staying with you after the museum closes and the lights go out over the drawer where the tablet is stored. Because a question written into clay 4,000 years ago by a scribe who was copying a classification list of human types is not supposed to still be open. It is supposed to have an answer by now. The tradition should have provided one. The later copies of the material should have completed the entry. Scholarship should have reconstructed it. But the 8th entry is still incomplete, still a question, still waiting. Pull back from the individual entries for a moment, not because the individual entries are not important, they are, but because the system they form together is more than the sum of its parts. And the system only becomes visible when you hold all 8 slots in mind simultaneously. You have a category of human being who carries structured knowledge before it is transmitted to them. You have a category whose constitution is calibrated to the edges between states, who feels thresholds the way some people feel weather changes in their bones. You have a category whose constitutional makeup resonates with the lunar cycle in a way that produces accuracy without inference, and whose associated astronomical text describes the moon as set rather than simply present. You have a category that carries structural affiliation with the primordial deep, the layer beneath the layer, the Abzu that existed before the current Viine order organized the sky, and that is described as kept rather than named, maintained outside the act of ordering rather than incorporated into it. You have a category that functions as a conduit, that transmits the old code without necessarily knowing it is doing so, and that is classified as restricted in the administrative record because unmanaged transmission has consequences. You have a category whose classification marker appears in a destroyed archive and whose surviving description places them specifically in the space between world arrangements, between one organized state of things and the next. You have a category described as present before the counting began, assigned no function in the current world, recorded in the list with flat bureaucratic precision as a type that predates the current era of human accounting. And you have a vacancy, a slot held open, a question pressed into clay. These are not 8 separate things. Look at the structure they form. One category holds the content. One can feel where content ends and something else begins. One is calibrated to a positioned celestial object, a structural element of the sky that the Sumerians described as placed rather than naturally occurring. One is affiliated with the layer beneath the current order, maintained outside the naming. One conducts the content through without holding it. One exists most specifically in transitions. One predates the current world's record, and one is waiting. That is not a list of human traits. That is a functional diagram. That is the description of a system that processes, guards, maintains, transmits, and bridges structural content from one arrangement of the world into the next. The me, the divine ordinances, the codes that govern the structure of all things, the content that can be given, taken, held, lost, transported, recovered, the content that does not belong to any single civilization or era, but is instead the fundamental architecture that any organized world must run on. The 8 bloodlines, taken together, look like the personnel of that system. The carriers and the sensors and the gates, and the deep keepers and the conduits, and the transition walkers and the pre-world survivors, and the one position still waiting to be filled. That reading may go too far. The evidence does not require it. The tablets are damaged. The translations are partial. The administrative context of the list is not fully reconstructed. Scholars would, with good reason, want more before accepting a reading that treats an ancient Sumerian classification text as a functional diagram of a trans-historical system for maintaining the structural codes of the world. But the reading does not require the tablets to prove it. It only requires the tablets to suggest it. And what the tablets suggest, in the carefully phrased, administratively formatted, damage-scarred, fragmentary form in which they survive, is that the Sumerians were tracking something. 8 types, 8 constitutional categories, 8 slots in a structure they either designed, inherited, or observed, operating around them. The Sumerians did not invent the me. In their own account, the me were given to Enki for safekeeping. They came from before the current divine order. They were entrusted to the god most associated with the primordial deep, with wisdom, with the knowledge that predates the organization of the sky. The current world runs on the me. The me are older than the current world. And the people who carry the me, the 8 types, the 8 slots in the maintenance system, are described in the same terms. Older than their apparent function, constitutionally equipped for roles that the current world has only partially mapped, present before the counting began, kept outside the naming, calibrated to celestial objects described as placed, connected to a deep that was sealed before the current order was organized. The comfortable reading of all this is that it is elaborate mythology, rich, internally consistent, beautifully developed mythology, which the Sumerians undeniably excelled at. The 8 bloodlines are a mythological framework for understanding human diversity, a way of assigning sacred significance to different constitutional types, a poetic system, not an operational one. That reading is comfortable because it puts the strangeness safely in the past. It makes the 8 bloodlines a thing ancient people believed, not a thing that might still be true. But the administrative context keeps pulling back. The format of the list, the dry, precise, columnar style, the classification markers, the restricted designation on the 5th type, the registration language around the 4th, the way the 7th entry reads not like a legend but like a personnel file for a category of worker who predates the current employment system. These are not the textual signs of mythology, they are the textual signs of record-keeping. And the 8th entry, the question, the vacancy, the slot held open, is the most disturbing detail of all, because myths do not have vacancies. Myths are complete. Myths tell you what exists and why. They do not leave a slot in the structure empty and ask what is still waiting to be placed. Systems have vacancies. Administrative records have incomplete entries. Classification lists have slots that the record keepers could not fill because the category they were trying to describe had not yet made itself fully legible to the system tracking it. The 8th bloodline was on the list. The scribe knew it was there. The scribe could not complete the description. And the question the scribe pressed into the clay, what is still waiting to be placed, is not the question of someone writing mythology. It is the question of someone maintaining a record who has reached the edge of what the record contains. The question the 8th entry raises, and does not answer, is the question this video has been building toward. Not, are you one of these bloodlines? That is not actually the right question. The right question is, what is the system for? What is the old code? What is being maintained across the transitions between world arrangements by 8 categories of human being whose constitutional types are carefully tracked in administrative records filed beside grain tallies? The me are the answer, but the me are also a question, because the Sumerian texts describe the me as the operating principles of all ordered things, the decrees that make kingship kingship, music music, the craft of the smith, the craft of the smith. The me are not magic, they are structure. They are the organizational architecture that any world must run on to be a world rather than chaos. And if the world has been reset before, if the Sumerian flood narratives encode a real memory of a previous arrangement being ended and a new one beginning, then the critical vulnerability in any reset is the loss of the me, the loss of the structural codes, the loss of the organized architecture that makes a world function. The 8 bloodlines may be the solution to that vulnerability. Not a divine solution, not a supernatural one, a logistical one. 8 constitutional types maintained across resets because each one carries, conducts, guards, or bridges a different aspect of the structural code the world requires to be organized. The carrier type holds the content. The threshold type knows where the edges of the structure are. The lunar-calibrated type maintains timing coherence with a positioned celestial marker. The Abzu keeper maintains connection to the pre-named layer where the original code is sealed. The conduit transmits the code through time without needing to understand it. The transition walker carries the code through the space between arrangements. The pre-world survivor holds what existed before the current counting. And the 8th, still unplaced, still generating the scribe's question, may be the type whose function only becomes legible when all the others are in position. The type whose role cannot be described until the system is complete. That is a strange thought, but it is the thought the 8th entry generates. Not because the text says it explicitly, the text asks a question, it does not answer one, but because the logic of the system, if the other 7 entries are read as functional positions, points toward a completing position, a slot that closes the circuit, a type that the system needs but cannot fully describe in advance because its description depends on what all the others have done. What is still waiting to be placed? 4,000 years later, that question is still in the clay. The scribe who wrote it has been gone for longer than most of the world's currently surviving civilizations have existed. The tablet that holds the question has spent centuries in the earth, then in a storage drawer, then in the climate-controlled management of a museum institution that files it alongside thousands of other fragments. The 8th entry is still open, the slot is still vacant in the record. And the system, if it is a system, if the 8 bloodlines are positions in a structure that maintains the old code across the transitions between worlds, is either still running without its 8th position filled, or the 8th type has been there all along and simply has not yet been placed. Here is what the Sumerian hymns say must be preserved when a world ends. Not gold, not cities, not armies, not the names of kings, not the temples or the ziggurats or the accumulated material wealth of civilization. In a fragmentary hymnic tradition associated with the survival of knowledge through catastrophe, the textual tradition surrounding the Apkallu, the 7 pre-flood sages, the critical cargo is described with a word that translators have approached cautiously. The word is roughly rendered as the kinds. Not the things, not the people, the kinds. The kinds of things that exist, the constitutional categories, the types. When a world ends and a new one begins, what must survive is not the content of the old world's civilization. It is the structural types that any civilization requires to organize itself. The kinds of being that can hold, sense, transmit, bridge, guard, and complete the me, the operating codes of an ordered world. Because a world without the me is not a world. It is what existed before the gods organized the sky. It is the Abzu without Enki, the potential without the structure, the raw material without the architecture. The 8 bloodlines are the kinds. That is the reframe. Not 8 separate curiosities, not 8 distinct supernatural abilities or sacred ancestries or mystical heritage lines. 8 positions in the maintenance system for the structural codes that any organized world depends on. 8 constitutional types that the world requires, not because they are special in a spiritual sense, not because they are chosen or blessed or divinely favored, but because the system cannot run without them. The carrier holds the content. The threshold walker knows the edges of the structure, where one domain ends and another begins, where the world's architecture has its seams. The lunar calibrated type maintains synchrony with the celestial timing apparatus the current arrangement was built around. The Abzu keeper maintains the connection downward, to the layer that existed before the current naming, where the original code is sealed in the primordial deep. The conduit moves the code through time, through people, through the material layer, without needing the code to be understood in order to transmit it. The transition walker lives most fully in the space between arrangements, the period of reset, the catastrophic interval between one world and the next, when the old code must be carried through a gap that would otherwise destroy it. The pre-world survivor holds what the current world replaced, not as a museum piece, not as nostalgia, but as a living structural memory of a different arrangement of things that may be needed again. And the 8th type is the one the system needs to be complete, the one whose function emerges only when the others are in position, the one the scribe could not describe because the description can only be written from inside a complete system, the one the list holds open, question-shaped, pressing the clay with a mark that says, "This exists, I cannot tell you what it is, something is still waiting." Now, the question this video has been building toward is not whether you are one of these bloodlines. That question is less interesting than it sounds. The bloodlines are not a personality test. They are not a framework for self-identification or spiritual community or ancient heritage tourism. They are a classification system for constitutional types that a civilization with an extraordinary record-keeping tradition saw fit to maintain in the same document as its grain accounts. The question that actually matters is simpler and stranger. Why did the Sumerians need to track this? Administrative systems do not maintain categories without operational purpose. You do not create a classification marker, assign it a distinct sign, and include it in a personnel-style document unless you are tracking something you need to manage. The grain is tracked because grain moves and must be accounted for. The temple workers are tracked because they perform functions the institution depends on. The bloodline types are tracked because, what? Because they perform functions the system depends on. Because someone building or maintaining or preserving the structure of an organized world needed to know where the carriers were, where the threshold walkers were positioned, which individuals were lunar calibrated and therefore reliable for astronomical assessments that ordinary training alone could not produce, which individuals carried Abzu affiliation and therefore had access to the layer of the code that the current divine order had not fully incorporated, which individuals were functioning as conduits and therefore needed management to prevent depletion, which individuals existed most naturally in transitions and could therefore be positioned at the moments of institutional vulnerability that transitions create, which individuals carried the memory of the previous arrangement and therefore represented the continuity that any reset requires. The Sumerians tracked all of this, filed it in administrative documents, maintained the classification markers across generations of scribal tradition. They were not writing mythology, they were writing operational records. Records of a system they had either built, inherited, or recognized as already running in the population around them, a system they considered important enough to maintain in the archive alongside the most practically significant categories of information their civilization produced. The me are the structural codes of the world. The 8 bloodlines are the kinds of human being the codes require to survive. The list was kept because someone needed to know the kinds were still in the world. Someone needed to know the system had not lost any of its positions. And the 8th entry, the open question, the vacancy, the sign pressed into clay by a scribe who reached the edge of what the record permitted and found himself asking what is still waiting to be placed, may be the most important entry on the list. Not because it is the most powerful, or the most mystical, or the most dramatically satisfying, but because it is the one the record could not complete, the one the tradition preserved as a question rather than an answer, which means either the eighth type was never fully observed by the people who built the classification system, or it was observed and its description was destroyed, part of the archive that did not survive, the category of text that was lost before the modern record could reconstruct it. Or the eighth type exists but has not yet done what makes its function legible to the system that is waiting for it. All three possibilities produce the same result. The eighth entry is still open. There is a museum storage room somewhere, climate-controlled, row after row of tablets in drawers, numbered, catalogued, partially published, waiting for the scholarship that will eventually reach them. In one of those drawers, the list, the column of 8 entries, 7 constitutional types described with flat administrative precision, and at the bottom of the column, the mark that says something is still here, something has not been placed. The scribe who pressed that question into the clay has been dust for 4,000 years. The question is still wet, still asking, still carrying the shape of the hand that wrote it. What is still waiting to be placed? The drawer closes. The light goes out. The tablet waits in the dark, as it has waited since before the cities that surrounded it were ruins. The 8 bloodlines are still in the world. The system is still running. And somewhere, the 8th type is either already here and unrecognized, or is the reason the question was never answered. The vacancy in the list is not an error. It is a placeholder. It is the system acknowledging that the last piece has not yet arrived, or has not yet been seen, or has not yet done what it came to do. 4,000 years of waiting, pressed into clay, still readable, still asking,